have a dream. My four little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
The March on Washington served.
In this presentation, I will highlight the photograph Martin Luther King delivers the I Have a Dream speech from the podium at the March on Washington by Bob Adelman. In the wake of the violent attacks on civil rights demonstrators in Birmingham, Alabama, Philip Randolph, an elderly statesman of the civil rights movement, and his chief aide, Bayard Rustin, planned a march that would call for fair treatment and equal opportunities for Black Americans, as well as advocate for the Civil Rights Act, which had stalled in Congress. President John F. Kennedy met with the civil rights leaders on June 22, 1963, and stated his concern that the march was ill-timed and would end in violence. Kennedy voiced his concern by saying, "We want success in the Congress, not just a big show at the Capitol." Reluctantly, JFK endorsed the March on Washington while giving his brother and Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy the task of coordinating the organizers to ensure all security precautions were taken. The march ended at the Lincoln Memorial instead of the Capitol so as not to make members of Congress feel as if they were under siege. Bob Adelman was a volunteer photographer for both the Congress of Racial Equity, CORE, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNNC, and took some of the most iconic photographs of the civil rights movement. He photographed speeches, sit-ins, and marches in hot spots like Selma, Alabama in the 1960s. His relationship with these and other civic rights organizations allowed him to capture the stories of the civil rights movement in a way that projects both the vulnerability and passion of its activists. Adelman's unique vantage point is in part due to his closeness with the civil rights leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and John Baldwin. The March on Washington was a massive protest march which occurred in August 1963. It is known as the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Over 250,000 people and some 3,000 members of the press gathered in front of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. The march included musical performances and speeches by influential African American leaders to draw attention to continuing challenges and inequalities faced by African Americans a century after the Emancipation Proclamation. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a Baptist preacher and prominent civil rights speaker, was to speak at the end of the day, and this would be his national debut. This was an opportunity to reach a wide audience, as the event would be attended by over 250,000 people and televised across America. This speech was designed to persuade the public and government to take action against social injustice. His famous line, "I have a dream," was not in the original draft of the speech, but was encouraged when gospel singer Mahalia Jackson yelled out, "Tell them about the dream." Dr. King set aside his speech and crafted the remaining half of the speech on the spot. There was two distinct parts to the speech. The first half listed the injustices, segregation, police brutality, disenfranchisement, and discrimination, and urged a call for nonviolent action. The second half described the dream of peace and racial harmony, and a vision of the future where people will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. This photograph was taken of Martin Luther King Jr. as he was making his I Have a Dream speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial on August 28, 1963. Adelman captured Dr. King during his defining speech of the civil rights movement and the beginning of his legacy as a civil rights leader of the 1960s. As Martin continued in his speech, Adelman was near the podium on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. "I kept getting closer and closer until I must have been 7 or 8 feet away. I took 80 to 90 frames of him speaking, and it was probably the greatest moment in his life and the greatest moment in mine." In his book, 2000 King, The Photography of Martin Luther King Jr., Adelman remembers the 1963 march vividly. There's not a lot of times and places where one's ideals and the real world come together, but this was one of those places. Adelman was only 32 years old when he took this infamous photograph. Dr. King is the focal point of this photograph, as Adelman has placed him perfectly centered in the height of his speech with his arms outstretched, preaching to the crowd. The placement of him in the center emphasizes the importance of him as the subject and of the speech. The vertical pillars in the background are textural in nature and create a strong visual contrast and depth of field to the subject surrounded by his supporters at the podium. His outstretched hand, the podium, and the microphones in the foreground further develop the depth of the field, which emphasize the importance of the speaker as he preaches to the masses. The pillars contrast with the dark suit and skin of the speaker and help ground the speaker to the space. As the pillars soar to the sky, Dr. King's words soar to the audience and hopefully take flight the ideas behind the speech. This speech highlighted King's skills as a preacher and was part sermon and poetry, using rhetorical devices such as repetition, rhythm, and vivid metaphor to drive his points home. Historical, biblical, and literary messages were designed to stir the crowd to a peaceful solution and to persuade the public and government to take action against social injustice and to pass the Civil Rights Act. Adelman was on the steps of the memorial that day, and he took multiple images of the speech, each time working and moving closer and closer to the podium. Adelman was intentional to create a sense of vicinity and closeness. The lack of a horizon line, intentional use of the angular line, asymmetrical balance, and cropping creates a close and intimate point of view. Even though this is a huge crowd and gathering, Adelman was able to capture the emotion on Dr. King's face and the joy, the peace, and the calmness of the spectators around him as they engage in the vision of Dr. King's dream that afternoon. Adelman's photograph was and has been published in newspapers, magazines, books, television, and the web. It's one of the most widely used images for political actions all over the world. I Have a Dream is one of the most transformative and influential speeches of all times, and this is the most widely world-recognized photograph of the Civil Rights Movement. This is the defining moment of the Civil Rights Movement and Dr. King's national debut. His I Have a Dream speech was heard by not only the 250,000 in attendance, but was televised into homes across America. This image defines the power, peace, and joy of this iconic and peaceful march during our nation's history. It captures the defining moment of not only Dr. King's career, but also the Civil Rights Movement. Both the speech and the march helped to secure a passage of the Civil Rights Act, which was signed on July 2, 1964. The Civil Rights Act ended segregation and discrimination based on race and gender in the workplace, a battle we continue to address even today. Here are the resources that were acquired online, as well as resources for the photographs that were used in this presentation. Bob Adelman continued to take photographs as an independent photographer up until he passed away at the age of 85.